In this lesson, we're going to be talking about conditional statements. And the word conditional, I want to point out that has a root word of condition, such as under certain conditions. And that's what we're going to be talking about is things that are true when other conditions are true. So a conditional statement is a statement that can be written in if-then form, such as if this happens, then this is going to happen. It has what's called implication. Something implies something else. The symbolic form of this, if P happens and you'll draw an arrow, then that implies that Q is going to happen. This is read again, it's read as if P then Q or P implies. That's the implication I was telling you. P implies Q. P happening tells you that Q is about to follow up and it's going to happen as well. The hypothesis. It's the same type of hypothesis that you deal with in science. The hypothesis is the phrase immediately following the word if. So we're hypothesizing possibly that P might happen here. The conclusion, when we all know what a conclusion is, that's kind of like the end of a book. Well, it all happened. The end happened because of everything that led up to it. The Q happened because of the P implying that it would happen. So the conclusion would be the P part, and that's the part that always follows the then part of the word then, or the then part of the sentence. Okay, so let's identify some hypotheses and conclusions. Again, some P's and Q's. So here, remember that the hypothesis always implies the conclusion. Again, the hypothesis is the if part, the conclusion is the then part. So if you live in Nashville, that would be your hypothesis. You live in Nashville. Then you live in Tennessee. So the conclusion would be you live in Tennessee. I'm just going to put T in. And so one implied the other one. This was the if part, and that led to the point that if the if part was true, then the then part would be true as well. So number two, again, the hypothesis and conclusion says if the sum of the measures of two angles is 90, then they are complementary. So the hypothesis would again be the if part. So that would be the sum of the measure of two angles is 90. And the conclusion part would be the then part. They are complementary angles. And that's all you have to do to identify hypotheses and conclusions. The last one, a hypothesis, it would be the if part. If a quadrilateral is a square, then the conclusion part, it implies it has four right angles, so that would be your conclusion. And that's it. Writing conditional statements. Now, sometimes they're not in the right form for us. Sometimes we're going to have to write them in an if-then type form, such as number 4 says an obtuse angle has a measure greater than 90. That's not in if-then form, but let's try to identify what the conditions are, and then if those conditions are met, what the conclusion would be. First off, it says if you've got an angle that's an obtuse angle, that's your if. If an angle is obtuse, that was the conditions that must be met, and if those conditions are met, then we know the angle must be, the measure must be greater than 90. If an angle is obtuse, then its measure, and that would be without an apostrophe because it doesn't need it, its measure is greater than 90 degrees. So sometimes you might have to rearrange the wording to get it to fit. But again, now you can very easily identify the hypothesis, which is right here, and the conclusion, which follows up to then, which would be right there. Okay, number 5. All numbers divisible by 4 are also divisible by 2. So if a number is divisible by 4, and that would be the hypothesis part, that's the conditions. We know that if this is true, we can put then, and you can read the rest of it. All numbers divisible by 4 are also divisible by 2. So if a number is divisible by 4, then it's also divisible by 2. And that's it. That's your hypothesis and conclusion. Number 6, states on the East Coast border the Atlantic Ocean. So in order to border the Atlantic Ocean, it had to be on the East Coast. So if a state is on the East Coast, and we know that would be the conditions, then we would know then it would border the Atlantic Ocean. And I ran out of room there, so I just put Atlantic. So if a state is on the East Coast, that'd be your hypothesis. Then it borders the Atlantic Ocean. That would be your conclusion. Number 7, Valentine's Day is in February. So really short sentence. If it is Valentine's Day, then the month is February. There you go. And there's a couple of ways, you could rearrange the words a little bit different, but just make sure that the hypothesis there is we know that if it's Valentine's Day, then that implies that it's also February. And the last one, prime numbers only have 2 factors, one in itself. So here we're defining prime numbers. So if a number is prime, we know what goes along with that. Then, and it read the rest. If a number is prime, then it has 2 factors. And you don't have to put the end of that one in itself. We know what 2 factors mean. So if a number is prime, then it has 2 factors. And that completes, again, our hypothesis and conclusion. Hypothesis is the if part. The conclusion would be the then part.